דיסלקציה וליקויי למידה משפיעים על הליך הראייה והקשר ביניהם. מאז הוא מרצה בהרבה מאוד אוניברסיטאות ומחלקות לאופטומטריה בכל רחבי אנגליה עד היום. זאת אומרת, הוא מוזמן להעביר קורסים כמו שהוא מעביר כאן. בנוסף הוא מנהל של ה-Institute of Optometry, שזה מכון למחקר באנגליה. בנוסף יש לו גם קליניקה לאופטומטריה באנגליה, שהוא מקבל פציינטים ביחד עם אשתו. לפני שנתיים הוא ביקר פה ביחד עם אשתו, והיא מתעסקת בתחום של אלקטרופיזיולוגיה של הרשתית, במקביל לקליניקה, ככה שהם עובדים ביחד בקליניקה, וגם כל אחד מהם מתעסק במחקר, והוא יותר בתחום של ראייה. הוא כתב את הספר שאולי נתקלתם בו, Pickwell's Binocular Vision Anomalies, שזה יצא לאור ב-1997, ומאז, תודה. ומאז מוציא מהדורה חדשה כמעט כל שנה. גם כתב ספר שקוראים לה דיסלקציה וראייה.
חייב ביקשה סליחה רגע שאני אבוא, הכל בסדר?
Is everything okay technologically?
יש, הכל בסדר?
You need any sound?
No, I'm fine, thank
Okay, תודה רבה יוני.
Perfect, thank you very much.
בקיצור, זה מלא מאמרים, אני יכולה לספור לכם, אבל יש פה עשרות אם לא מאות מאמרים בתחום של ראייה ודיסלקציה, ראייה וליקויי למידה. רק שתדעו ש-learning disabilities, שבארצות הברית זה נחשב כאילו לקות של למידה, באנגליה הכוונה היא disability, כלומר גם אנשים שיש להם נכות או פיגור, זאת אומרת זה הרבה יותר רחב התחום שהוא יתעסק בו מאשר רק אנשים עם לקויי למידה. אז היי, בוקר אור. אז אני ממש שמחה להציג אותו בפניכם, כמובן שכל ההרצאות יהיו באנגלית. הוא מגיע לכאן פעם בשנתיים ומעביר לנו את הקורס הזה. פרופסור, יש לו פרופסורה, חוקר בעל שם עולמי, ו-thank you very much, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much to the expert inviting me here again. It's a pleasure to come back to Israel. This is the Institute of Optometry where I work in South London. We waited 3 years to have sunshine for that photo. So the weather here looks great to me, really warm, really dry, it's perfect. This is the plan, you've all seen the programme, and really what I would say is the workshop that we've got today on coloured filters, ideally we would have on the 3rd day, because there's a lot of background stuff to cover before that. But Leah explained that pretty much all of you will be here today, but not on the 2nd and 3rd day. So we've changed it round to have the coloured filter workshop today. But it does mean that the explanation, the theory, the research, the controversy about coloured filters is something that we're going to be covering in great detail tomorrow. But today we're going to be looking at the tools that are used with those. So I'm sorry it's slightly back to front, but I hope you'll bear with us. So this first talk really is what we need to cover before we go into the tools that we're going to look at in the workshop today. So this is an overview of the role of the optometrist in learning difficulties and specific learning difficulties. And this is really, if you like, a sort of a quick outline for the whole course. A lot of these things we're going to cover in more detail. So this afternoon I'm going to talk a lot more about the etiology, the causes of specific learning difficulties like dyslexia, what we think underlies those. And then tomorrow I'm going to talk more about how that relates to the visual perceptual training that we often have in behavioural optometry, how that ties in with what the educationalists tell us about dyslexia in this day and age. But this is an overview talk. I should acknowledge at the beginning of the course the co-workers that I've worked with over the years in much of the research that I'm talking about. I should also just say, disclose my interests. I wrote a book on dyslexia and vision that you can buy. It's designed for parents and teachers. I also co-authored a book with Peter Allen and Arnold Wilkins on vision and reading difficulties. This is designed for eye care practitioners. And if you want that, it's £15, so it's remarkably good value, and you can buy that from this website. I should declare that I do paid lectures for anyone who will pay. And some of these people are listed here, but the content's always my own. And the Institute of Optometry where I work, they have a sales company that sells products, and I invented some eye exercises, orthoptic vision therapy, that I'll talk about tomorrow morning, which I get a royalty based on the sales of those. I should say that although I work at the Institute of Optometry doing research, actually that's only 1.5 days a week. The other 4.5 days I spend in my own practice seeing patients every day. Most of my patients are normal patients, but a higher proportion than usual are people with problems like dyslexia. So when you Google dyslexia and vision, you come up with 800,000 hits. And how do you decide what to talk about in a lecture like this? Well, we're going to talk later on today about evidence-based optometry, how we work out which topics to take seriously and which ones not to take seriously. But just to outline the criteria for all of my talks, I'm going to concentrate on visual factors that have been shown to be correlated with dyslexia. So visual problems that in a dyslexic child are more likely to be there than in a child who's a good reader. And when you determine those correlates, typically the research that people do is to compare a dyslexic group with a control group. But you need to do certain things to make that sort of research valid. And in particular, you need to control for confounding variables. So classically, you'd control for the opportunity to learn. The two groups should have had an equal opportunity to learn, similar schooling and so on. And also you should control for other factors like intelligence. And the studies that have done that are the ones that I'm going to concentrate on. Now life gets interesting when we start treating children, and we treat them with interventions. And those treatments might be vision therapy, they might be perceptual skills training, they might be orthoptic or eye exercises for orthoptic problems. But really we should only take these interventions seriously if they're supported by high quality evidence from double-masked, randomised, placebo-controlled trials. And these are the interventions that I'm concentrating on. And ideally it should be published in interdisciplinary peer-reviewed journals. And there's a tendency in optometry sometimes to publish in narrow journals. I'm thinking of the Journal of Behavioural Optometry or Optometry and Visual Performance. I spent a lot of time in updating these 16 lectures over the next 2.5 days that I'm doing. I spent a lot of time looking at these journals, and when you look at them, they're not interdisciplinary peer-reviewed journals. They're not interdisciplinary in that they tend to just be written by optometrists for optometrists, which is not terribly helpful because most research on dyslexia is not done by optometry. And we need to be aware and make what we do appropriate to the larger body of evidence. Nonetheless, I've looked in those journals as well. So, an overview. I'm going to be talking today, tomorrow, about specific learning difficulties, and then on the last day I'm going to be giving presentations about learning disabilities. And those presentations on the last day are what I would call profound learning disabilities. So problems like Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, sometimes called intellectual impairment. Now the language is slightly confusing because in the UK we call those learning disabilities, but in America they tend to use the term learning disabilities to describe what we would call specific learning difficulties. And these are problems where the child's general intelligence and abilities are fine, and if you spoke to the child they would seem completely capable and intelligent, and yet they have specific difficulties with certain activities. And the classic one of these is dyslexia, where the specific difficulty is with reading and spelling. Others exist. Dyspraxia, for example, is a specific difficulty with coordination. Dyscalculia is a specific difficulty with mathematics, and so on. So today and tomorrow I'm concentrating on the specific learning difficulties. Sure. And as I said, there are some problems with the classification. I mean, for example, when you look at people with autism, where does autism fit in with this classification? You'll see some children with a mild degree of autism, typically with Asperger's syndrome, who have a specific learning difficulty, if you like. And you'll see some children with profound autism, much more severe autism, who would be better characterised as having a profound learning disability. So there are some problems with the classification, as well as the problems that I mentioned with the language. So this is the topic for today and tomorrow. And this talk is about the role of the optometrist. And we can't talk about vision and dyslexia without mentioning a few key researchers. And Valentino is a leading researcher in the dyslexia world, who really made it his mission, or one of his missions, for over 30 years, to prove what he called the no visual deficit hypothesis. So he's a leading psychologist researching dyslexia in America, and his argument was that dyslexics don't have a visual deficit. Dyslexia is all about phonological deficit, and really we shouldn't be thinking about vision at all. The point that he makes about phonological deficit is one that you'll hear a lot about today, because there's a huge amount of research supporting that, supporting the notion that disabled readers perceive letters and words accurately, but when they try and label them and translate what they see on the page into the sound components that make up language, and when they try to work with those sound phonological components, that's where they have the problem. So Valentino's early work, going back into the 70s, really said, well, disabled readers, dyslexics, are good at perceiving letters and words fairly accurately. So the vision's okay. It's all about the higher levels in the brain. So he argued that a child who reads was as saw is perceiving them correctly, but their trouble is with labelling those words. Now we're going to talk a lot more about this afternoon in a lot more detail. When you actually look at the literature, there are people in America particularly, but also in the UK, who argue about the no visual deficit, and there are people who argue about there is a visual deficit, and it's turned into a bit of a war. And the war between them is all about who's found the cause of dyslexia. And I think we need to move away from that war into a more nuanced world, a more subtle world, a world of better understanding, where we don't see dyslexia as having a cause. We see there as being a group of people who are characterised as being dyslexic, but within whom there may be several contributory factors. And certainly vision is not the main cause of dyslexia. Valentino is right in as much as the phonological deficit lies at the heart of dyslexia. But there are certain visual problems that you'll hear about over the next 2.5 days that are more common in dyslexics than in good readers. And in some cases, those visual problems can contribute to the burden that child has. So this brings us to what causes dyslexia, and as we've said, it's mainly a problem of making words into sounds, which is the phonology, but visual problems are a co-occurring factor in some cases. And so the background to this is the controversy around it. And as I've referred to, there have been polarised views on vision and dyslexia. And I would argue that what we should be looking at when there's two extremes is really you plot a course pretty much halfway between those extremes, and that's where the reason is. That's where the sensible view is. So I'm going to characterise the extreme views as zealots on the one side and deniers on the other. And so the zealots, and there are optometrists in the UK who argue that visual problems are the cause of dyslexia. Still, despite all the research we're going to review this afternoon showing they're not. And on the other side, there are the, if you like, the Valentino characters saying that vision is irrelevant to dyslexia. And all you need to do to those people is say, okay, close your eyes and read this book. you can't do it. So clearly there's some flaw in that argument. And so I would argue that visual problems can co-occur with dyslexia, not necessarily being the cause, but being a contributory factor. We're going to talk, we're going to have the workshops today, and we're going to have the lectures tomorrow on the use of coloured filters to treat a condition called visual stress. And visual stress, I think, affects only about 1 in 5 people with dyslexia. But there are some people, the zealots, if you like, who argue that visual stress is a major cause of dyslexia. And there's an American psychologist called Helen Erlen, and Erlen argues that 1 in 5 people in the population, so 1 in 5 of you, should be wearing coloured glasses. So clearly that's a zealous view. She says it's 80% of people with dyslexia should be wearing coloured glasses. I don't agree with that, but that's an extreme zealous view. The skeptic view on the other side, the denier, says that visual stress just doesn't exist. And I would argue that, again, visual stress can co-occur with dyslexia without being necessarily the cause. So my interest in this started in my PhD work, and this was published in the early 1990s. And what we did in this was we compared a group of dyslexic children with a group of good readers. And we carried out a battery of optometric tests, and we said, how do the dyslexics differ from the good readers? And one of the things we looked at was symptomatology in the straightforward optometric way that you would use in your practices. And we found that the dyslexic group reported more transient blurring. They said sometimes it started off clear, and then after a while the text became blurred. This happened in about 1/4 of our dyslexics and less than 10% of our good readers. They also reported some transient doubling of the text. Again, about 1/4 of our dyslexics, less than 10% of the good readers. And if you like, the research I did then and since then has all been about trying to find out who has those symptoms, why they have those symptoms, and what we can do to help them. But we need to acknowledge the proportionality, because 26%, 23% means that 3/4 of dyslexics don't have any symptoms. So clearly it's not going to be the cause of dyslexia. And even in this 25%, if we take away some blurring, we're going to help them, but that doesn't mean that the visual problem is the cause of their dyslexia. And indeed, what we did in this study was we carried out a visual search task that I'll show you this afternoon to try and get to the etiology, to see to what extent any visual problems were causing a reading problem. And we concluded that the visual factors were not a major cause of the dyslexia. But clearly, if they've got blurring and doubling, if we can get rid of that blurring and doubling, it's going to help them. And we'll talk a lot about coloured filters. Many of the people that coloured filters help, they get headaches when they read, and if they use coloured filters, they don't get headaches. Well, getting rid of the headaches is not going to cure their dyslexia, but clearly it's going to be helpful for that child. So the role of visual factors in dyslexia can be summarised by starting with a definition of dyslexia. We've got more on that this afternoon, but here's a simple definition. It's a difficulty affecting the skills involved in accurate and fluent word reading and spelling. The characteristic features of it are, as we've said, a difficulty in phonological awareness, verbal memory problems, and verbal processing speed. Visual problems are not the cause of dyslexia, and therefore the term visual dyslexia is really a wrong term. It's a misnomer. It shouldn't be used. But there are visual problems that may contribute to reading difficulties, and in these cases visual treatment may help. So what this means is that optometrists are not in the business of treating dyslexia. And when we see a child who's dyslexic, who has a reading problem, then if we find a visual problem, we can say we can help them, but we should never claim that we're treating their dyslexia. So the last thing I want to talk about is in this particular talk, is the optometric routine that we can do when we assess people with dyslexic problems. We know the standard eye examination. We look at symptoms and history, ocular health, binocular vision, refraction, and other tests of visual function. And you will know this. If we're seeing a child with dyslexia, we need to look carefully at their family history, their birth details, and it's interesting to reflect on some research on the importance of symptoms in prescribing glasses. So we did some research in the UK that showed that symptoms are paramount in prescribing glasses. And that research was replicated and extended here at Hadassah, which showed a similar thing in Israel, that in Israel for some prescriptions optoms were twice as likely to prescribe glasses when the patient has symptoms. So symptoms are so crucial to optometric practice. We need to look at those, and we'll talk later about how we assess those in more detail in dyslexia. Now, I'm not going to say anything for the next 2 days about ocular pathology other than this slide, because ocular pathology is not a correlate of dyslexia. There are no eye diseases that you're more likely to find in a dyslexic than a good reader. But of course, if we've got a child, any child could have pathology. So we need to be aware of that. This was a patient referred to the specific learning difficulties clinic at the Institute of Optometry for a routine eye exam. They had reading difficulties, they had headaches, they reported that words appeared to move on the page. Now all of these things are things that we're going to talk about in the next 2 days as problems that we should investigate with a BV workup, an accommodation workup. We should maybe look at the effect of coloured filters. And in this child's case, the test that was most important was a visual field test that revealed this quadrantopia. And this was quite scary because this was the first field defect we'd had in that clinic in many years. And because there's no, we never got to the bottom of this. We referred the patient, and of course the ophthalmologist never told us what was going on. But this could have been a brain tumour, it could have been even migraine, something as innocuous as migraine, something as serious as a brain tumour. But the point of this slide is to say that when we see children with the characteristic visual symptoms that we look for in dyslexia, we should do the basic tests as well, because there could be something else going on that we don't want to miss. And when I say we should do the basic tests as well, we mustn't forget the most basic of optometric tests, which is looking at the refractive error. So this was an adult student, a university student, referred to our clinic, and she reported the classic words. Actually, she was referred to my practice, I remember her now. She was quite interesting because she had gone all through school failing. And she'd never done well. She'd left school, she got a job in a supermarket stacking shelves. And the supervisor said, "Oh, I think you're better than this, work on the till." So she started working on the till, she was doing well, but she kept getting a headache at work. So she came to see me, and she reported again visual symptoms, and her problem, eye health, was fine, but she simply had reduced acuity. And the reduced acuity resulted from refractive error. She just had uncorrected astigmatism. I said, "Well, wasn't this picked up at school? I thought maybe there's keratoconus there and it was missed and it wasn't present before." And she said, "Oh, I never had an eye test before." And the screening day, the one day in the UK that vision was screened at that school, she was off sick. So she just had an uncorrected refractive error. She didn't have dyslexia, she didn't have anything. She thought she'd been sent to college by the supermarket because they thought she was capable of management, and they'd detected a learning problem. It wasn't a learning problem, it was just a refractive error. And when she had glasses to correct the refractive error, then she stopped getting headaches, she started achieving. So refractive error is not a correlate of dyslexia. If you look at 100 dyslexic children and you look at 100 good readers, the refractive error distribution in the two groups will be very similar. But it could be there nonetheless, so we mustn't forget the basics. So the normal eye exam, we do all of the normal checks that we do, and when we look at a child with specific learning difficulties, a child with dyslexia, or a child with suspected learning problems. So parents often say, "I want to come and see you with my child because he's struggling at school, but is not being diagnosed as dyslexia. I know you specialise in dyslexia and vision. Do I need to get the diagnosis of dyslexia to come and see you? And the answer is no, because if a child is struggling, that's all we need to know. That's enough reason for the child to get a detailed workup. And what they need is a normal eye exam plus what we call in my practice a special investigation. And what we do at these special investigation appointments is instead of a 20 or 30 minute eye exam, we give them a 50-minute eye exam. We book them longer, we charge them a fee to cover that, and in that longer eye exam we start off with a very detailed questionnaire that goes into detail about their symptoms and history, and family history. We do extra tests of binocular vision, we do extra tests of accommodation, and we do extra tests for visual skills, visual stress. And then we do a report summarising what we've found. So here's the symptom questionnaire that we've developed at the Institute and in my practice over a number of years. And if you'd like to use a similar questionnaire, if you don't already, you're very welcome to go to my practice website up here and download. If you go to the website and type in that, you can download the questionnaire as a Word document, and you're very welcome to use it if you want to and edit it and do whatever you want with it. It's evolved over the years. We've got on the first page their developmental history, their birth details, whether they had any severe illnesses or operations in the first year. On the second page we talk about their academic problems, reading, spelling, writing, maths or other, and they tick to say whether they've had an educational psychology assessment. They give their visual history, their last eye exam, spectacle use, vision therapy, any patching they've had, any coloured filters they've used in the past. On the third page they fill in details about symptoms and history, including their visual symptoms, and there's a lot more questions here than usual. So we ask the usual question, is your distance vision clear and is your near vision clear? But then we ask, does it ever go blurred? Because many children with the sort of problems we're talking about on this course, when they first look at the book, it's fine. When they look at the book for longer, for a few minutes or a few lines, it starts to go blurred or move around, or they start seeing distortions on the page. So these questions are important to ask. We ask about double vision, we ask about sore and tired eyes, general health, and headaches as well. The number of, because you'll see headaches emerge as a theme on this course. So we look at the number of headaches they have, and we have a number of questions about the headaches that are designed to determine whether those headaches are migraine or similar to migraine. And on the last day, on Thursday, we're going to talk more about migraine and the characteristic signs of migraine. These questions detect migraine, and then there's questions on the last page about behavioural factors. So, for example, whether they skip or leave out words or lines, whether they get very close to the page, whether they tilt their head on one side. And finally, family history of learning problems, dyslexia, migraine, epilepsy, other conditions that may be present. And here's a sort of summary. Anita Lightstone worked with me for many years, and we published papers back in the 1990s on a suggestion